If a job's worth doing, it's worth doing right. The same goes for cleaning. Simple Green All-Purpose Cleaner delivers powerful, concentrated performance across multiple surfaces, from tools and equipment to floors, workspaces, and more. It's strong enough for serious cleaning, yet formulated to work without harsh chemicals that demand heavy protective gear. Get the job done right, safer, stronger, smarter. That's the power of Simple Green. Learn more at simplegreen.com.
This is episode 422 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Michelle O'Callaghan of the University of Reading. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Here today to take us back to turn of the 17th century England and explore some of the words that could land you in hot water or express your anger, frustration, or dismay in the most colorful way imaginable is our guest and linguist, Nathalie Vienne-Guerrin. Nathalie Vienne-Guerrin is professor in Shakespeare Studies at the Université de Montpellier Paul Varet and a member of the IRCL Institute for Research on the Renaissance, the Neoclassical Age, and the Enlightenment. She has published extensively on Shakespeare's evil tongues in The Anatomy of Insults in Shakespeare's World, Shakespeare's Insults, a Pragmatic Dictionary, and The Unruly Tongue in Early Modern England, among others. She is general co-editor of the Cambridge University Press Shakespeare on Screen collection and of the Shakespeare on Screen in Francophonia database. She is co-editor-in-chief of the international journal Cahiers Elizabethien and of the online journal Arrêt sur Scène. You can see more about these organizations, the current research work of Nathalie, and her collection of excellent publications on Shakespeare's insults in the show notes for today's episode. Bonjour, Nathalie. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life. So glad to have you here today.
Thanks for having me today.
In early modern England, were insults merely rude sayings, or could someone actually get in social, political, or even legal trouble for using specific phrases?
Well, to answer this question, I would say both. Let me explain. It's always hard to talk about the early modern England as a whole, in general. And as I'm not a historian, I cannot generalize. So it's hard to say in early modern England. But I work on Shakespeare, and what I can say is that in Shakespeare's plays, insults can be, just what you call rude sayings. Indeed, we can think of the word whoreson, for example, that is used about 40 times in Shakespeare's plays, and that is usually used as an adjective. The key words of Shakespearean insults are the following. You've got the word villain, which occurs about 400 times. The word knave, about 200 times. The word slave, the word rogue, and the word rascal, between 150 occurrences and 80 occurrences. Not all of these occurrences are used in an insulting context. But what is interesting about these words is that their insulting nature is, for most of them, based on what C.S. Lewis termed the moralization of status words. You see, villain, rogue, slave, they're all connected with social status. But what is also interesting is the way Shakespeare, in Shakespeare's plays, question what we can mean by the word rude. Now, you mentioned the rude sayings. Well, this word is related to the French word rude, and it has a lot of meanings. And so it means that if we have a quick look at the Oxford English Dictionary, for example, it means rough, crude, but also lacking refinement, uncivilized, or impolite, ill-mannered, or ignorant, uneducated. Those are all the meanings of that word rude and rude in French. It also means hard-hearted, unkind, severe, pitiless, and even violent and brutal. And so what we can say is that Shakespeare's insults are far from being rude, in fact, but are very often highly sophisticated. And the word whoreson, for example, that I've just mentioned, is rarely used alone, but rather in sophisticated strings of abuse. And for example, in the first part of Henry IV, which is one of my favorite plays, you've got this string of abuse, which is thou whoreson, impudent, embossed rascal. So whoreson will not come alone. This expression, rude sayings, in Shakespeare's plays, well, in his plays, rude sayings are often not rude, but artistic, elaborated, clever, witty associations of insulting words. But beyond this pleasurable inventiveness of insults, to which we'll probably come back, what Shakespeare's plays reveal is that insults could indeed have an effect on people's lives, definitely. Social, political, and legal, as you said. I could take just one example from King Lear. Let's say King Lear, which is also one of my favorite plays. So you remember the story of King Lear. And at the beginning of the play, the king asks his 3 daughters to tell him how much they love him, so that he may give each of them one part of his kingdom. And the good daughter, Cordelia, does not manage to flatter him. And she just says nothing. That is to say, she delivers this word instead of compliments and flattery. She just says the word nothing. And this nothing is received by Lear as an absolute insult. And this has an incidence on the whole play. That is to say, it triggers off a social, political, personal crisis. So it has what, well, one theoretician of insult terms, her name is Evelyn Largwech. I've used her work a lot, and she's theorized this as the effet injure. That is to say, the insulting effect. She makes a difference between insult, so rude saying, and the insulting effect, the effect it has both on the enunciator and on the one who receives the insult. So Cordelia in King Lear saying this nothing, which is in no way rude. Well, this nothing is received as an outrage, as an insult by the king. So this shows that in matters of insults, and it's still the same now nowadays, but it's true of Shakespeare's plays, the question of interpretation and reception is key. The insult is as much, not to say more, is as much in the ear that hears it in the interpretation as it is in the tongue that delivers it. So I think that is absolutely essential. And that is why insults could lead to a lot of defamation cases in Shakespeare's days. So I've worked quite a lot on these cases that are known as cases for slander. And insults and their interpretations are at the heart of these legal procedures or legal cases. And the question in Shakespeare's days was to define what words were actionable, so that was the term, actionable, that is to say, what words could lead to an action in justice, and what words that were not actionable, and it all depended on the context. So in matters of insults, both now and in Shakespeare's days, what is key is what, I name a pragmatic approach. That is to say that we should always take into account the context of enunciation and reception of those words. Well, Shakespeare's plays show that very well. So definitely to conclude on this question, social, legal, political trouble could emerge after insults. And there are a lot of studies of quarrels between neighbors in Shakespeare's days, of quarrels that could be violent and that could lead to the law court, to legal cases. And what treatises of the time showed was that the question of interpretation of words was, very tricky, very subtle. And especially the difference between slander and mere insults, the differences were quite subtle.
Shakespeare's characters frequently use abbreviated oaths like Zounds or By'r Lady from The Tempest or Splud, which we know are contractions of much stronger religious phrases. Was Shakespeare deliberately softening these expressions because of laws like the 1606 Act to restrain abuses of players? Or, had he written something more direct as God's blood spelled out fully? If his characters had said that without the abbreviation, could he or his company have faced fines or punishment?
Yes, indeed. Well, the fines were planned. But so Shakespeare's plays are indeed full of, I say Zounds, because I think it's for God's rooms. But I've seen that, I've heard that you pronounce it Zounds. Maybe there are the two pronunciations. I would not be sure of that anyway. So Zounds, bloods, slight, God's body, Jesus, by Christ, by cock and pie, God's bread, cock's passions, good sooth, death, etc. Well, Shakespeare's plays are full of these oaths. Some of Shakespeare's plays reflect a debate on swearing at the time. And especially in the first part of Henry IV, we'll see that I mention Henry IV quite a lot. I think it's a key play when it comes to studying Shakespeare's insults. In the first part of Henry IV, when Hotspur gives his wife what we can call a lesson in swearing in Act 3, Scene 1. He reacts to her mild, in good sooth. Okay, she says that, in good sooth. So that would be considered as a mild oath. And he asks her to use what he calls a good mouth-filling oath and leave in good sooth. You're right, there were distinctions between the mild oaths and the good mouth-filling oath. And we can imagine the effect that this speech from, delivered by Hotspur in Henry IV, Part 1, the effect it could have on censors at the time. The question of the oaths and the 1606 Act to restrain abuses of players should be understood in the context of a period during which many anti-theatrical pamphlets were published. These pamphlets or these treatises denounced theatre as the place of all vices and as the place of all insults, including insults to God. And the 1606 Act was published, I quote, for the preventing and avoiding of the great abuse of the holy name of God in stage plays, interludes, May games, shows, and such like. And there are a lot of religious texts on swearing in Shakespeare's days. And the main question that these texts raise is, what makes an oath lawful or unlawful? So at court, it was the difference between actionable words and non-actionable words. So here, lawful and unlawful swearing. So many oaths, whether they be contracted or not, were an object of censorship and denunciation, probably more when they were heard on stage, more than in print. According to some researchers, what counted was to prevent people from hearing these words. Not only uttering them, but hearing these blasphemous words. And fines were indeed mentioned in the Act to restrain the abuses of players. But I am unable to say whether a lot of them were paid, in fact, because there seems to have been some flexibility in the treatment of those transgressive occurrences. What is probable is that the context in which the words were delivered was taken into account to decide whether they were allowed or not, whether they were lawful or not. And so there was probably some flexibility. And what is interesting also to notice is that the prevention against swearing goes, in fact, through an attempt to control theatre. And it tells a lot about theatre as a place you should control, in fact, at the time. Maybe I could, just add as a footnote that, as you know, this attempt to control and censor Shakespeare's plays was prolonged in another way in the 19th century when Thomas Bowdler published his Family Shakespeare and from which all potentially offensive words were removed. And that is why we now use the expression to Baudelarize a text, to refer to this kind of censorship.
When we look at plays like Romeo and Juliet or Twelfth Night, where insults escalate into duels, how closely does Shakespeare reflect actual Elizabethan dueling codes and this concept of verbal honor?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mentioned defamation cases or actions for slander earlier on. What we should have in mind is that these legal procedures were in fact a way of limiting or trying to limit the rather deadly tradition of dueling at the time that could decimate the nobility. And yet, a lot of dueling manuals or treatises still circulated in England in Shakespeare's days, many of which were translations of Italian manuals. And I've worked a lot on one of them, which is Vincenzo Saviolo's Practice, well, in 2 books, which was published in 1595 in England. I've worked quite a lot on this treatise, and we know that Shakespeare had access to this book, as it is parodied in the comedy As You Like It. When Touchstone, the fool, when he enumerates what he calls the 7 degrees of the lie. The 7 degrees of the lie. This reference is now lost on contemporary audiences. But this referred to the way dueling manuals were, in fact, guides giving very subtle advice for people, for men, to avoid duels as much as possible, paradoxically. And hence the speech, Touchstone's speech on the degrees of the lies in As You Like It. And so the lie, what is the lie? Well, it was considered as the most offensive insult that should trigger off the process of the duel. And so it just consisted in saying to the opponent, "Thou liest," okay, or "You lie." And this was the most serious insult you could hear. The worst accusation was this accusation of lying. But if you said, for example, "The truth is otherwise," instead of saying "Thou liest," if you said "The truth is otherwise," this was not considered as an accusation that would lead to a duel. You see the subtlety. So you could avoid the duel if you avoided saying this direct lie. Thus, in Vincenzo Saviolo's treatise, you find all the subtleties of language that avoid the dueling process. And both in Romeo and Juliet and in Twelfth Night, which you're right to mention, in those 2 plays, Shakespeare parodies this fashion of the duel and of the dueling manual. And what is interesting is that this parody can be both part of a tragic design, as in Romeo and Juliet, and of a comic design in Twelfth Night. And what the 2 plays show is the transgression of all the dueling codes that were present in the Elizabethan dueling manual.
You discuss taming of the tongue in Richard III and taming of the shrew. In early modern England, were women's insults judged differently from men's? How did gender expectations shape what counted as verbal disorder?
Mm-hmm. Well, when I worked on tongue treatises published in England in Shakespeare's days, I especially worked on 3 treatises. One of them was a translation of a French treatise entitled A Treatise of the Good and Evil Tongue, published in 1592. Another one by William Perkins, entitled, I think that the titles are interesting, A Direction for the Government of the Tongue, According to God's Word. That was in 1595. And then another treatise by George Webb a bit later in 1619, entitled The Arraignment of an Unruly Tongue. So when I worked on these treatises, what I found, which may seem surprising, is that the men's tongues are, well, in these treatises, presented as being as untamable as the women's tongues. I expected to find more misogynistic remarks on the women's tongues, But what came out of these treatises is that both men and women need to control this unruly organ, that is to say, the tongue. And yet, beyond this, some researchers have worked on the figure of the scold or the shrew in early modern England. And they showed how the scold's tongue was an object of taming through very cruel and concrete means, such as the bridle. It's Linda E. Booth who worked a lot on the scold's bridle. That is to say, something that was supposed to prevent a woman from talking. And another means that has been studied is known as the cucking stool or the ducking stool. It meant that you put the shrew on a chair and you plunged her into some muddy water, muddy river, as punishment. And so it's D.E. Anderdown who's worked a lot on this. So there is some debate about the frequency of these punishments. But this tends to show that in the Elizabethan society, the figure of the scold or the shrew was considered as problematic for society. She constituted a character that needed to be controlled in a society where women were supposed to be chaste and silent. And that is what the taming of the shrew represents, in fact. And one can find in the taming of the shrew, one can find traces of those punishments. And in Richard III, well, Richard, in fact, silences the women's tongues, the women's lamentations and abuse in the sound of his drums. He says, "Thus will I drown your exclamations," thus relegating the women's words to the status of being mere noise. But so you've got this. But on the other hand, the way the plays represent balanced skirmishes of wit between men and women, especially the comedies, this suggests that men and women are often equal verbal sparring partners, which tends to put them on the same level. Now, finally, as far as gender issues are concerned, what is striking is that, if you consider Shakespeare's corpus, what is striking is that the main insults that are used to attack women are based on three words, in fact, or on three images. The image of the shrew, so women are accused of being shrewish, cursed, scolding. The shrew, the whore, well, there are many synonyms for that word, but basically whores, and witches. And the three often go together. And this appears very clearly when you read the plays. And so while there's a great variety of fields and approaches of insults for men, for women, these three aspects, shrew, whore, and witch, these three aspects often go together and are extremely recurrent.
As you're listening to the show today, you can see visual extras that coordinate with our conversation inside That Shakespeare Society. Members get access to the research that goes into the making of our show, including for this week, some links to the documents we talk about. And there's even a downloadable guide I put together for you where you can use Shakespeare insults to fling at your friends or even your enemies, I guess. Come inside and see all the extras while you listen to the show today by clicking That Shakespeare Society at CassidyCash.com/episode 422. That's CassidyCash.com/EP422. And now let's dive into the history. In plays like Othello and The Merchant of Venice, insults wound more deeply than swords. How did early modern culture understand the psychological or spiritual damage caused by words? Did they believe that verbal abuse could literally harm the body or soul?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you consider that Shakespeare's plays reflect his time in all its complexity, I would tend to think that the Elizabethans, like us, considered that words could be both harmless and very harmful. Harmless compared with acts. And that's what a play like Richard III shows. And women insult because they cannot act. Words are their only weapons. So words are a sign of impotence. But on the other hand, you can do a lot with words. I refer you to J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words, which is seminal for linguists and for those who work on performative language. words can be harmless and even a sign of impotence. But on the other hand, at the same time, words are very harmful. And in Othello, as you said, words definitely wound. So in the case of Othello, Desdemona, you can say that she goes through a traumatic experience, definitely, and that she's traumatized by words. So she's confronted with Othello's rage, if you remember, and she first says, I understand a fury in your words, but not your words. Meaning that, in fact, the insult becomes a gesture, a verbal gesture, as strong as a blow. In fact, I understand the fury in your words, but not your words, not your meaning. This is, I think, quite important. Then she utters the word whore. Othello accuses her of having betrayed him. And so she calls her the whore of Venice. And so she repeats the word, but paradoxically saying, I cannot say whore. It does abhor me now I speak the word. So with a pun on whore and the verb abhor. And finally, so she says the word whore, saying that she cannot say it. And finally, she's so harmed by the word that she can no longer pronounce it. And she uses a periphrasis. So there's a short dialogue with Iago, which is highly ironical, of course, because Iago is the source of her misery. But here is the short dialogue. Am I that name, Iago? That is to say, that name that I don't want to utter. Am I that name? And he answers, what name, fair lady? And here's the periphrasis, very complex. As she says, my lord did say I was. It's almost a tongue twister. This word, whore, here is how she defines it, or she avoids it, such as she says, my lord did say I was. So the process of labeling, am I that name? The process of labeling is here clearly shown, and this can be related to what Judith Butler has called linguistic injury in her, great book, Excitable Speech. So Desdemona here euphemizes, avoids the offense to be able to just bear it. Paradoxically, what I find interesting, Brabantio, that is to say Desdemona's father, said at the very beginning of the play the following words. Here's what he says, but words are words, that is to say they are nothing, words are words. I never yet did hear that the bruised heart was pierced through the ear. I never yet did hear that the bruised heart was pierced through the ear. Yes, indeed, Desdemona's heart is pierced through the ear. I think there's a lot of irony retrospectively when we hear Brabantio say that. And you mentioned the Merchant of Venice. Yes, the Merchant of Venice can be seen as being based on a character, Shylock, who cannot forget, who cannot swallow, literally swallow, the abuses he has suffered as a Jew. And so definitely in this play, words wound too. And a final example of, I think the best example of this ambivalence between words that are nothing and words that harm, I find in Much Ado About Nothing, so the comedy Much Ado About Nothing, which is perhaps the play that most clearly expresses this ambivalence of insults. Because in that play you find two basic quotations. On the one hand, Benedict says about Beatrice, she speaks poniards, and every word stabs, meaning I am insulted, I am harmed, I'm hurt by these words. So she speaks poniards, and every word stabs. That's on the one hand. And a bit later in the play, it's Beatrice who tells him, foul word is but, this says only, foul word is but foul wind. Meaning, if you just exchange insults with a Claudio, it is nothing. What I want you to do is kill him. And so in these just two very short quotations, you've got, for me, the whole ambivalence of insults and of Shakespearean insults, both poignards and foul word, nothing.
I think Much Ado About Nothing is also an example of that equal sparring partners that you mentioned in terms of verbal equality between those two characters. That's a real demonstration of what that would look like.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
We know that flighting was a recognized tradition of competitive insult in early modern Britain. Can you walk us through how these exchanges actually worked in practice? Were flightings staged literary performances, or spontaneous verbal contests, or something in between? And how did people know when someone had won a flighting contest?
That's a difficult question. Thank you. Well, coming back to the definition of flighting, it's defined as the action of flight, contention, wrangling, scolding, rebuking. So that's the general definition, but it also refers to something very precise, which is a poetical invective. And chiefly it refers to a kind of contest practiced by the Scottish poets of the 16th century, in which two persons assailed one another alternately with tirades of abusive verse. So it's something that is originally very ritual and very sophisticated and poetic. Well, according to some scholars, especially Priscilla Burkhardt, she notes that before the 16th century, the term referred to non-literary practices as well. And the Old English word flightan, meaning to strive, to dispute. And the word is also more specifically used to refer to a Scottish literary form of verbal fight, and the most famous of which was the flighting of Dunbar and Kennedy, which I haven't read for a long time, which I read many years ago, which is a bit monotonous, Well, the word flighting is really inscribed in a literary tradition, in a strong literary tradition. But then the term has been extended to be defined as a ritual exchange of abuse. A ritual exchange of abuse. That is to say, what do I mean by ritual? It means that words do not really mean what they mean, and they are not supposed to hurt. Okay, they are part of a game, and so that's why we refer to ludic flighting. So I think Margaret Galway in 1935 was the first to apply this term to Shakespeare's comedies. Now, she selected a few exchanges of abuse and termed them or defined them as moments of flighting. But what is striking in that ritual dimension, so we can speak of flighting moments in, as you said, in Much Ado About Nothing. Okay, you've got a ritual exchange of abuse between Beatrice and Benedict. We can find some of them in Love's Labour's Lost, basically in the comedies. But sometimes what is striking is that the ludic dimension may be endangered, may get lost in the process. And at some point in the exchanges, the contract of ludic aggression or non-aggression can be broken. And that is what happens in Much Ado About Nothing, when Benedict says about Beatrice that she speaks poignards. In the context of a play in which, insults are supposed to be festive, are defined as a merry war, at some point, this merry war may have a bitter taste. And that's what Benedict's referring to the poignards delivered by Beatrice may refer to. Well, to conclude on this, flighting is a very sophisticated way of exchanging abuse. It must lead to verbal inventiveness and to verbal excess. And that is what you have, for example, in the exchanges between the lovers in the comedies, but also between Hal and Falstaff in Henry IV. And you said, who wins? You asked the question, who wins? It's hard to define and to decide really who wins. It may depend on the way those scenes are staged, on stage, are dramatized on stage. I have in mind how Beatrice concludes the first exchange with Benedict, and she says, "You always end with a jade's trick." So you don't, at the end of this first exchange, you don't really know who's won, and I suppose it's for us to decide who is the winner in that type of balanced exchange.
Shakespeare does give us unforgettable insults like, "Thou art a boil, a plague sore," or "You starveling, you elf skin," or "You poisonous bunch-backed toad," which was one of my favorites, or "A cream-faced loon." Were these insults drawing on recognizable medical theory, sociable stereotypes, or class markers, or even just animal reputations that would have made them feel especially cutting to a 16th century audience, which we might miss in the 21st century?
Well, yes and no. Well, if I have written a dictionary of Shakespeare's insults, it is precisely to answer that kind of questions. That is to say, I've tried to interpret Shakespeare's words in their specific context. And the dictionary that I wrote, the subtitle is A Pragmatic Approach. Well, it's a pragmatic dictionary of Shakespeare's insults, because I think we should take both the large context of the Elizabethan period into account and the context of the plays. If I take the first insult that you quoted, "Thou art a boil, a plague sore," well, definitely it refers to skin diseases that were quite an obsession in Shakespeare's days, and because you had an obsession with the purity of the skin, and so it says something that is recognizable in medical theory, definitely. But at the same time, if you read these words in their context, they take another ring, and the impact of the words are I think, different. So let me quote the passage from which this "Thou art a boil, a plague sore" is taken. So it's taken from King Lear, and it's Lear who says this to one of his daughters, Goneril. So it's part of a dialogue between a father and a daughter, which makes the insult even more, striking, I guess. But before you've got this insult, you have, "But yet thou art my flesh, my blood, my daughter, or rather a disease that's in my flesh, which I must needs call mine. Thou art a boil, a plague sore, an embossed carbuncle in my corrupted blood." So the impact of the words is completely different when you have in mind that it's the declaration of a father to a daughter. You are my daughter, but you are, to quote from The Tempest, "the thing of darkness that I acknowledge mine." Okay, so it makes the insult much more moving. It qualifies it a lot when you consider it in its context of enunciation in that play. The eel-skin, or so there's a variant for this. So "You starveling, you eel-skin." I tend to read eel-skin rather than eel-skin. So this is part of the famous, flighting scenes in Henry IV, Part 1, between Hal and Falstaff. And eel-skin, this illustrates thinness. You can understand this if you consider that the exchange of abuse between Hal and Falstaff, which are ludic, the exchanges are ludic, are festive. They in fact represent the battle of Carnival and Lent. You know, that famous painting by Peter Bruegel. And so Hal and Falstaff here play the battle between Carnival and Lent. Falstaff being the big, fat man, being opposed to the thinness or the thin Hal. And so this eel-skin has got a meaning in that particular context. The whole, and again, if you consider it in its context, so here is the flighting moment in which you find this precise insult. "Why, thou clay-brained guts, thou naughty-pated fool, thou whoreson and obscene, greasy tallow catch, this sanguine coward, this bed-presser, this horseback breaker, this huge hill of flesh." So that's Hal against Falstaff, and Falstaff replies, "Blood, you starveling, you eel-skin, you dried neat's tongue, you bull's pizzle, you stockfish, oh for breath to utter what is like thee, you tailor's yard, you sheath, you bow case, you vile standing tuck." And so the eel-skin is part of this panorama of thinness. And so it is emblematic of the world of Lent that Hal embodies in the first part of Henry IV. So that's the contextual, I think, aspect that is quite interesting to understand this word. The toad, because you refer to the, I think it's the bunchback toad. Is that what you said?
The bunchback, yes.
Poisonous bunchback toad.
Yes.
Well, the toad, yes. So there's a famous book on animals by Edward Topsell, published in 1608. So according to Topsell, the Latin calls the toad buffu because it swelleth when it is angry. So bunchback toad, that's what it means. The expression as loathsome as a toad is proverbial at the time. And toads were also associated with witches who used them in their confections, according to Topsell again. And if you consider that the character, so it's here, it's Richard III, the character is also compared to a bottled spider. And you see that the insult, in fact, contributes to the portrait that is given of Richard in that play. And the cream-faced loon refers to cowardice, because the color cream, or the whiteness, white is associated with cowardice, and so that's what this expression means in the context of Macbeth.
In all of these insults that you've studied so far and wide here through Shakespeare's plays, do you have any favorites, ones that you think are just shining examples of insults that are particularly smart or very well done in context?
I like this nothing that I mentioned, which triggers off the whole play, the whole of King Lear. But, well, apart from that, I think I've got many, you can find many, paradoxically, strangely enough, I think, many good insults in King Lear, which is a dreadful tragedy, a horrible tragedy, so moving. I weep whenever I see King Lear. I'm really moved. And yet there are very funny moments of insults. So one of my favorite is, "Thou whoreson Zed, thou unnecessary letter." So the two go together. "Thou whoreson Zed." Z, that is to say the letter Z. "Thou unnecessary letter." And so when you try and analyze why these expressions, or this expression, whoreson Z, is insulting, well, it is because the letter Z is at the end of a dictionary, okay? And so it means that it is not, well, it doesn't have priority. And also, when you have a look at the letter Z in dictionary, you see that there are very few names, very few words. So it means that you are a non-entity. You are an unnecessary letter. You are worth nothing. And the unnecessary letter, so Shakespeare gives us the footnote that goes with the whoreson Z, thou whoreson Z, thou unnecessary letter. He gives us the means to understand this. And why is the Z unnecessary, or when can it be considered as unnecessary? It's because the letter did not exist in Latin. And so Latin was still a very important language in Shakespeare's days, during the Renaissance. And so if the letter does not exist in Latin, it means that it is an unnecessary letter. So I really like this one. Again, from King Lear, I like a base football player. So it's Kent who abuses Oswald. And among the strings of abuses that he hurls at him, you've got this base football player. And I like it because it sounds completely incongruous now, but at the time, football was considered as a low sport, a low kind of a sport. Everything that had to do with feet was considered as low. And so it explains why here it's used in a derogatory way, compared with tennis, for example, which was a higher level of sports. I like the insults from King Lear. And well, to just give you another idea, I can mention, well, I can read the string of abuses or abuse that Kent hurls at Oswald. So be prepared. A knave. What dost thou know me for? Who am I? You are, Kent says, a knave, a rascal, an eater of broken meats, a base, proud, shallow, beggarly, three-suited, 100-pound, filthy, worsted-stocking knave, a lily-livered, action-taking knave, a whoreson, glass-gazing, super-serviceable, finical rogue, one-trunk inheriting slave, one that would be abhorred in way of good service, and are nothing but the composition of a knave, beggar, coward, pander, and the son and heir of a mongrel bitch, one whom I will beat into clamorous whining if thou deniest the least syllable of thy addition. So, and it's the whole string, okay? I've not collected them from different moments in the play. It's a whole string of abuse. And you would not associate this with King Lear, which is really tragic. But this moment is a high moment of comedy, in my view.
It's fantastic, and you wouldn't really associate that with King Lear. You don't think of King Lear as a source of impressive zingers, but now I'm going to go and find a way to watch this play and look out for that in particular. Mm-hmm. From your work into this topic and insults in general, if we're new to this branch of history and we want to explore further, what are some additional resources you can recommend we use to learn more?
Well, I would recommend to read dictionaries. Well, I love dictionaries of all kinds. The dictionaries, well, I've written my dictionary of Shakespeare's insults, so if you want to have a look at it, don't hesitate. But there's also, well, a seminal book by Ashley Montagu, which was entitled The Anatomy of Swearing, published originally in 1967 and re-edited in 2001. And so The Anatomy of Swearing, and there's another Encyclopedia of Swearing by Jeffrey Hughes. So if you're interested in that type of language, I would advise you to have a look at those. Now, for theoretical references, I really enjoyed reading Jean-Jacques Le Cercle and Denise Riley's book entitled The Force of Language, published in 2004. Patricia Parker's seminal Shakespeare from the Margins, I always recommend, because I think it was seminal for close readings of Shakespeare's scripts. And it's an invitation to explore what may at first seem marginal, well, insults, for example, but you can see that there's a lot of meaning in margins. And for the listeners who read French, I would recommend Evelyne Largueche's L'effet injure, from pragmatic to psychoanalysis, which was really, well, for me, it was really seminal, making the difference between an insult and an insulting effect. For me, it's key to understand insult in Shakespeare's plays and beyond Shakespeare's plays. And there was also a very book that I found really interesting entitled Shakespeare's Noise. And the word noise is interesting because it's related to the French word noise, which refers to a quarrel. So Shakespeare's Noise by Kenneth Gross, which I really found very stimulating a few years ago. So, but I've got a whole library of books on insults and linguistic aspects.
As we've mentioned today, Nathalie has several books on the insults of Shakespeare, and those, along with these fabulous foundational recommendations, they'll be a great beginning if you'd like to dive into the history and context of insults and verbal sparring from the Elizabethan period. We'll place links to all of these recommendations in the show notes for today's episode, so stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Now, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Okay, well, I would take The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, perhaps surprisingly, because it's the first book that I ever read in English when I was 17 years old. And it was all covered with my annotations, at the time. And at a time when there were no electronic tools to help us read texts and in a foreign language. So I would find it quite funny and interesting to reread it 40 years afterwards and to try and see the journey that I have made compared with this, what I really found a wonderful text full of wit, and which was my first reading in English.
What a beautiful journey of self-discovery and reflection. I'm sure it'd be fascinating to go back and check and see what your notes were then and whether or not you maintain those thoughts 40 years on. How exciting. Mm-hmm. That's an excellent choice. Mm-hmm. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, at the moment, I work basically on two things. I'm working on a short-term project that consists in comparing insults in Shakespeare's plays and in plays by the French 17th century playwright Jean Racine. So I think it will be interesting to see. I think I see the specificity of Shakespeare's insults. You see them all the more since you compare them with other authors, and it could be completely different in classical French theatre. So, that's my intuition, my hypothesis, but I'm working on this. Well, I'm working on a longer-term project on Shakespeare's evil tongues generally. After focusing on insults, I want to go beyond insult. Well, I've been working on that for many years. On evil tongues, and so this will include works on flattery, malediction, railing, and babbling, which I tend to do a lot. And which is one of the sins of the tongue, babbling. So I guess I should stop.
No, it sounds like really exciting exploration of words. How much fun to unpack all that's there to know. And we'll look forward to hearing more about this project as you get it completed. Thank you so much, Nathalie, for being here this week and sharing the history of insults in Shakespeare's plays and his lifetime, and arming us so well with the knowledge about how both to receive and to fling our own powerful one-liners in theater as well as in life. This has been a fun conversation. Thank you so much for being here to share it with us. Mm-hmm. All of the resources we've talked about in the show today, including more information about Nathalie and her work and the publications on insults that she has put together that are so good, and you should definitely go check them out, are all linked directly from the show notes that go along with today's episode. You can find these at CassidyCash.com/episode 422. And don't forget to click That Shakespeare Society to see insider extras and behind-the-scene research content that went into the making of today's show, as well as the opportunity to talk directly with Nathalie if you have questions about insults you'd like to send her way. All of that is happening on That Shakespeare Society, so be sure to click That Shakespeare Society at the show notes page. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/episode 422. That's CassidyCash.com/EP422. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.